Constable Hopkins came back into the room and demanded that either Alder or Bryce tell him what was going on. Alder and Detective Holland stared at one another for a brief moment. In that moment, they truly understood what they would have to do. "We know how to find the Jackal, Constable," Detective Holland said to Hopkins as he continued to stare at Alder. "Are you in?" The constable looked at the two other men with a great confusion. "The Jackal?" he asked. Elsewhere, in a dark abandoned crypt, a small boy was crying for his mother. It was Oliver Wyatt, Constable Hopkins' 5-year-old nephew. He had been taken from his backyard while his mother slept. His screams were screams of pure terror. It was dark, and he had no idea where he was. His screams died down after a few hours. His voice was becoming hoarse, and his eyes were adjusting to the dark. Oliver sat down and curled himself against the large concrete box. He was still weeping and calling for his mother. There was a noise from the other side of the box. Oliver jumped to his feet and backed himself as far away from the box as he could. It was the Jackal. He leaped up onto the concrete casket and leered at the child with yellow glowing eyes. Oliver was afraid, but was silent, for he hoped that the gray man would help him to find his mother. Suddenly, the thin figure leaped from where it stood and pinned young Oliver to the floor. The next 5 minutes were an agonizing hell for poor young Oliver. He found his voice when his flesh was torn from his body. His last screams were not of terror. They were the screams of sheer torture. The last sounds that came from the little boy scarcely sounded human. His screams were drowned out by the blood that spewed from his throat. 10 minutes later, there was no trace of Oliver Wyatt, for the Jackal devours flesh and bone. Back at Detective Holland's quaint home, Detective Holland and Alder had prepared for their final stand against the Jackal. Alder had drank the blood from the vial given to him by Clee and was waiting in an underground cellar of Detective Holland's home. Across the street, Constable Hopkins and Detective Holland remained hidden and awaited the signal from Alder. The 3 men waited for what seemed forever. Time had ceased to move forward. Constable Hopkins, unaware of his poor nephew's demise, thought to himself that perhaps the gypsy woman had been mistaken or was just downright insane. Alder was second-guessing himself of what he needed to do. He could leave London and pursue a normal life. He had found his brother Jack. He was safe and alive. There was no villain to extract revenge upon, but Alder knew, deep down, that his brother had to be killed. The Jackal had murdered nearly 1,000 children across the world in the past 10 years. Alder had to remind himself that the only way it was going to end was for Alder to end it himself. The air grew cold in the night. The fog began to move in a slow rolling tumble as a disturbing presence could be felt near the home of Detective Holland. The detective and the constable could feel the time drawing near, and Alder could feel his heart for the first time in over 10 years. It had returned to Alder. It had come home to die. Slowly the cellar door opened. Standing atop of the staircase, the gray skeleton stared down at Alder with its yellow eyes. The Jackal had no heart. What was once Jack died the moment he gave into his hunger and killed Harry Von Doss. He would kill Alder just the same.